Picture this. You walk into the theater, or you pull up a streaming app to watch a new entry in one of your favorite franchises. The video comes up, and you eagerly anticipate a thrilling night. And then, it's not what you expect. Sure, the familiar faces are there, but something is off. Be it characters not acting like you remember, or not being treated with respect, or maybe their actions or achievements in the previous entry aren't being taken seriously, or even straight up forgotten. So, you leave feeling dissatisfied and possibly angry. You take to the internet and you are flooded with articles, posts, and videos decrying critics of the new thing as, insert your preferred discriminatory word here. And your response is an understandable, "That's all wrong! I didn't like it because I thought the story was bad, or my favorite characters weren't respected, or the lore wasn't kept consistent. I don't hate women or minorities. I just want good writing and consistency with the rest of the franchise." If you weren't angry before, you certainly are now. Eventually, you stumble across others who agree with you. They're a minority in the internet-wide discussion, but they are just as furious as you are, both at the people handling the franchise and the media decrying criticism as discriminatory. So you follow them, and you stick with them as they continue to cover new releases of the franchise and the media's coverage of it, even as the views they are expressing start to shift. This is not my story, but it almost was. And today, I'm going to tell you about it. I wasn't going to make this video until later on, but with the discussion sparked by the cancellation of The Acolyte, it's become incumbent upon me to share my story about the culture war that's been raging around this franchise for nearly a decade now. Not only is it something I have a lot of thoughts about, but it's something that no one seems to know the whole story of. Granted, I've seen some comments that have noticed what I've noticed, but whenever I see someone on the outside speak on it, they always seem to lack understanding of why fans are angry and disappointed, or why the flames of controversy grew as big as they did. Always responding with genuine confusion, yet still expressing concerns over what fans are doing with their time now. And I probably don't know everything either. I'm only here to offer up my personal experience, in the hope that it will clarify a few things for people on both sides. Because that's what I do here. Just a couple things before we begin. 1. I know there are a lot of hot takes when it comes to this franchise, and let me preface every criticism I'm about to give with, you can disagree with me. Different people have different interpretations of the same story, and that's totally fine. If you think my view of this or that is stupid, that's fine. I'm just here to give my personal take. 2. I will not allow any hate or harassment of any kind in the comments. You can disagree with each other respectfully, but no misogyny, no racism, no homophobia, and no transphobia will be tolerated. 3. I know a bunch of people are going to say, or at least have the attitude, that Star Wars is just a dumb fun space wizard and space battle story because it's for kids. Lucas even said so himself.
It's a film for 12-year-olds.
To you I say, yes, but that's no excuse for a severe decline in quality. Stories aimed at kids do not need to be bad or take themselves less seriously. Plenty of stories aimed at kids are still good and even great enough to keep adults interested, and of course, they are respected because they are great. I'll give a few examples most of you should be familiar with. X-Men, Justice League, Spectacular Spider-Man, The Owl House, Inside Out, The Incredibles, How to Train Your Dragon, The Hobbit, etc., etc., etc. And of course, I can't go without mentioning the ultimate example, Avatar: The Last Airbender, a children's cartoon from the same network as SpongeBob SquarePants and the Fairly Odd Parents. Yet it's considered one of the greatest TV shows of all time, even almost 2 decades after its initial release. The fact that Star Wars was initially aimed at kids is no excuse for it falling off as much as it undeniably has. And before anyone tells me it was always bad or goofy fun, yes, it has gone up and down in quality before. But as I'll explain later, I don't think the quality then and now are entirely comparable. Now, as for the goofy fun claim, all those examples I just gave have their sillier moments too, and they are all the better for it. With all that said, let's set the stage. I went to see The Force Awakens in theaters when it came out. I had been a fan for most of my life at that point, having watched the previous trilogies on DVD and the first few seasons of Clone Wars, and all of the Clone Wars microseries, and I was excited to see a movie I'd been anticipating even before Disney bought the franchise. I saw Episode 7, and I thought it was okay. It felt too close to A New Hope in terms of its story, but it had everything I expected a new Star Wars movie to have. Then Rogue One came out, and again, I was one of those weird people who liked it. It was one of the best movies in the franchise for me, and still is. It was a story about a group of oddballs who aren't the best behaved, but they grow, and they saved the day despite how desperate the situation was. Then the next year, The Last Jedi came out, and I came out of the theater thinking it was okay. I mean, I had criticisms like some things not making sense, but I was okay with that. Then I turned to the internet, and I heard the fans speak, and I was reminded of what the previous story was supposed to be about. It was easy to forget at the time since it had been so long since I last watched the original trilogy, but the original trilogy was about a ragtag group of rebels fighting against impossible odds, but still having hope. Hope that things could get better one day. But in the sequel trilogy, the Empire just comes right back as if it never left, and after Rise of Skywalker, Palpatine also just comes right back as if he never left. This was a massive disappointment for a number of reasons. Now, from the discussion I've seen from other fans, they were disappointed too, for many reasons. Most notably, the characters from the original trilogy and how they were treated. Han is a good example to start with, since in the original movie, he starts as a scoundrel who just steals to get by and learns by the end to be a more selfless hero who stands by his friends and saves the day. In the sequel trilogy, he just reverts back to his old smuggler ways and isn't helping his wife or his best friend. That's not good. But the thing that really enraged people was what happened to Luke. In the original trilogy, he starts out as naive and whiny, but by the end, he's grown more disciplined and capable, but he still remained very hopeful, still having faith in his father even when no one else did, even his ghost mentors. And in the final battle, he empathizes with his father and overcomes his rage, rejecting the dark side once and for all. And he was right to have faith in his dad and hope he could change, and he did. It doesn't make up for everything Vader did, but it showed that light can be found even in the darkest of places, and that hope can still win. In The Last Jedi, he becomes an angry, jaded loner that needs to be shown some hope and reminded of his friends and family to get him to return to the fight. I want to be clear here. That sort of thing can work as a character arc in a vacuum. Indeed, I've seen it done this way. But that is not Luke Skywalker as I and the fanbase remembered him. We can sit here and debate about this all day about how it's realistic, or it makes sense actually because XYZ, but that doesn't matter. It's still going to feel like cognitive dissonance to many people. We saw him complete his arc and achieve something great. Then he immediately loses all of it. This portrayal is just antithetical to the core appeal of the character. As a point of comparison, the same thing happened with Superman in Man of Steel. He lets his father die, and he doesn't go out of his way to save every life he can. And he's so angry. Luke became a cultural icon because he rejected his rage, kept faith in his family and friends, and never gave up hope. Superman was created to be a kind beacon of hope who always helps those in need. The versions we see in The Last Jedi and Man of Steel respectively are not that. Now that isn't to say there shouldn't be a place for alternate takes on iconic characters or concepts. In fact, Star Wars Visions, DC's Injustice, and Marvel's What If and various comics, games, and other media do this spectacularly, and there are fans, even hardcore fans, who like this type of alternate interpretation. And if you happen to prefer one of these alternate takes, that's totally fine. It's just that it being a major release in the mainstream media for the franchise makes it seem like it's replacing the original. More on this later. That was the biggest complaint for many fans, and while I agree, personally, my biggest complaint was a bit different. The Rebels in the original trilogy didn't win. Everything they fought for and built, including rebuilding the Jedi and the New Republic, just got reset, and then redone with different characters this time. Which begs the question, does the fact that the Empire came right back in a different form and the new Jedi Order was destroyed and needs to be rebuilt again, make what came before pointless? This was an idea I wrestled with for a long time. Now, the answer depends on the individual. There are people I know who don't care about the lore or the timeline, or just care about the world. Personally, I debated with myself for months because I'm someone who likes to wholly immerse myself in the story and the world. I'm also someone who likes to look at the big picture when it comes to series-long plots, and I get invested in seeing everything fit together. And I felt, in a word, cheated for being invested in a story for so long, only for it to amount to nothing in the long term. Because of this frustration, I kinda stopped watching for a while and didn't even start watching The Mandalorian until Season 2 was airing. And that was only because of a brief reconciliation I had as a result of some more fan discussions. But even then, I eventually stopped watching, partially due to the declining quality I saw with The Bad Batch, which I did enjoy the first season of, but couldn't deny I was somewhat underwhelmed. And everything I've heard about the series that have been released since then didn't help. Except Andor, but it was too little too late for me at that point. And again, this is just me. Needing to have my emotional investment in a story pay off in some way when I'm invested for the long term is just very important to me. This is why I usually restrain myself when it comes to stories with continuity troubles like American superhero comics. Most of the time, I need what I'm reading or watching to matter in the story and have reason to believe it's not going to just be retconned or tossed aside. The bottom line here is that some of the choices made in the sequels are just irreconcilable for many fans, especially many hardcore fans, including me. Now, there were a lot of other issues people had with those films, such as hyperspace ramming, Holdo, Finn's character, etc. But there is one more big point I'd like to tackle before moving on. And that's the protagonist. Rey, the center of many fan theories during the trilogy, only to have been decided to be a granddaughter of a failed clone of Palpatine at the last second. She who has been the subject of much controversy in the fandom for a few reasons. Now, it's been revealed by Daisy Ridley that there wasn't really a plan for her, something I'll talk more about later. But for right now, the most important point is one of the biggest sources of controversy in discussions surrounding the trilogy even today. How powerful she is right out of the gate. So, let's look at the points. Rey's an orphan from Jakku, who scavenges ships until Finn enters her life and is on the run from the First Order, and she joins up with him, getting hunted down by the First Order, then after joining the Resistance and infiltrating the bad guy's superweapon and getting captured, learns how to use Jedi powers, including the Jedi mind trick, and uses them to escape. Then, after Finn gets defeated by an injured Kylo Ren, Rey takes the lightsaber from him and defeats him. After some minimal training, she demonstrates she doesn't understand how the Force works. After getting captured again, willingly this time, she convinces Kylo to turn on his master and fights off Snoke's guards with him, though they spend some time separated. Then they fight again, and it ends in more of a stalemate. Finally, she trains some more and is able to use Force healing and becomes, quote, all the Jedi and finally defeats Palpatine for good. A lot of fans have complained about how powerful she is, and this resulted in a lot of other fans defending her, saying things like Kylo Ren was injured or Kylo Ren helped her in the throne room. Now, in order to explain why I'm dissatisfied with this justification, I need to go on a bit of a tangent about the existing lore and themes. So, to take a step back, the core conflict of Star Wars throughout the Skywalker saga is between the light side and the dark side of the Force. In simple terms, the light side is good and the dark side is evil. But moreover, the light side is selfless, protective, merciful, and slow to grant power. The dark side is selfish, greedy, dominating, controlling, and is quick to grant power. Light side Force users exist to protect and serve the people by settling disputes peacefully, whereas dark side Force users try to gain ultimate power or revenge or some other fundamentally selfish goal by any means necessary, no matter who they step over in the process, attempting to gain control and become so powerful that no one can stop them from getting whatever they want. The thing is, while the dark side grants power quicker than the light side, overall it falls short of the light side if a person stays true to it for long enough. What this leads to is new light side Force users getting beaten and even steamrolled by dark side Force users, especially more experienced ones, and even highly skilled non-Force users at times. The light side user might be tempted to use the dark side thinking it will grant them power to do what they want to do, and may even fall to it thinking it will make them powerful enough to do so. But if they remain true to the light side, often accepting what they cannot change, rather than trying to become powerful enough to control what happens to them, and of course they train for many, many years, they can become more powerful than most dark side Force users. And the best can become powerful enough to challenge even the worst of them. Being a Jedi requires years of training, discipline, strength of will, and a willingness to accept things you can't control. And Rey does not have that. Sure, she sometimes takes a hit or fails to turn Kylo Ren, but she doesn't have to fight for every ounce of power she gains, unlike previous Jedi in the franchise. Yes, Kylo overpowers her before she really understands how to use her powers, but once she does understand, she Jedi mind tricks a guard, something that is supposed to be a learned ability, as previously established, and she defeats a dark side user who has been training for years with barely a day of experience. Yes, Kylo Ren was injured, but that didn't stop him from beating Finn, and even if you subscribe to the idea that the injury and Finn combined wore him down and Rey just finished up, that still feels unearned. It means she was basically gift-wrapped an opponent in a weakened state for her to beat. She didn't have to suffer a heavy loss and be tempted to the dark side, and barely any time later, with barely any more training, she's able to fight Snoke's guards even when she's separated from Kylo, and later is able to at least match Kylo himself, who was also fighting the guards. And to take another look at the Kylo Ren was injured explanation, let me ask, when was it established that Force users could be injured like that, as to leave them defeatable by a soldier and a newbie Force user? Previous portrayals of Force users, light or dark, are extremely difficult to hit since they can sense incoming attacks, and either dodge or deflect almost any of them, including blaster fire. And when they are hit, it's usually a deep cut or severed limb and it completely incapacitates them. They can usually recover from Force lightning without too much trouble, but lightsaber strikes, not so much. And yes, it is possible to kill even trained Force users with blaster fire, but that's usually from overwhelming numbers like during Order 66. A Force user getting weakened and worn down and eventually beaten isn't really something that happens in Star Wars without them being straight up overpowered, since usually they can counter anything that might get thrown at them. They usually need other Force users to defeat them. Previously established Jedi have needed to take their time to gain their powers, especially to defeat powerful enemies. Luke didn't even use Force Pull until his second movie, and he doesn't even use Jedi Mind Trick until Return of the Jedi. Even after some training, he isn't able to beat Vader until Return of the Jedi. Ahsoka gets wrecked by Ventress in the Clone Wars movie and is only able to properly fight her later on. And in Rebels, she's progressed so much she can completely dominate two Inquisitors who beat Ezra, Kanan, and Zeb down with little trouble. Speaking of Rebels, Ezra, despite being able to push an enemy down using the Force without any training, didn't know what he was doing and he needed training before he can use any powers reliably in combat, and even more training before he can even stand up to an Inquisitor. Also in Rebels, Kenobi is shown to be so old and powerful that he can completely axe Darth Maul in one swing, an enemy who used to give him a challenge even during Clone Wars. Even if you think that Rey isn't too powerful for her amount of training, she lacks the same sense of linear progression that Jedi in training previously had, since she is just powerful from the beginning. And that brings me to a point I'm calling Star Wars is not Marvel, or DC. Or rather, Force users are not superheroes. You would be forgiven for seeing Star Wars as just another sci-fi franchise where cool space battles and clashes of power happen, not unlike many blockbuster movies we get nowadays. But Star Wars is not like many of those franchises, especially superhero franchises that have dominated pop culture for the past decade and a half. Superhero stories tend to be more overt power fantasies with characters gaining abilities that overwhelm almost anyone else in their world and completely destroying their enemies, only getting challenged by powerful villains whom they defeat in their own way. Many heroes defeat supervillains through sheer force of will, but some have other ways. Iron Man does it with technology and intelligence, Spider-Man often does it with agility and trickery, and Captain Marvel with overwhelming power. And to take a quick look at DC, you could make the argument that Superman defeating Zod, a trained soldier, is illogical, but it's not the same situation as Rey beating Kylo Ren. Zod isn't used to Earth's atmosphere, and the powers he as a Kryptonian has there. Superman breaking his helmet earlier in the film is a big moment because Zod is flooded with sensations he's unfamiliar with, something Superman had time to adjust to. Zod has to figure out how to use his powers during the final fight with Superman, but even then, DC and Marvel do not have the same established conventions around gradually gaining power and eventually defeating powerful villains. Sure, sometimes you see heroes training to improve their powers or skill, but they're few and far between, in comparison to Star Wars, where training is usually central, again, discounting exceptions like Visions. Hence, existing DC fans instead complained about different things after seeing Man of Steel, mainly the lack of kindness, hope, and saving as many lives as possible, all qualities that previous mainstream versions of Superman had, and the interpretations we've gotten since then have, because that is the established convention of Superman in DC media. Those qualities are why Superman fans show up, hence why they complained when a new piece of Superman media lacks them, just like a hard-fought linear progression of power over many, many years with discipline and training before accomplishing something significant like defeating a powerful foe is the established convention of Star Wars. Fans of Star Wars expect a battle between good and evil, selflessness and selfishness, protection and domination, and they expect good to have to persevere through setbacks and antagonists that are too powerful for them to defeat at first. The Force Awakens and Man of Steel are two different cases of two different fan bases getting angry at a recent addition to a franchise for different reasons, but both are cases of hardcore existing fans raising criticisms because the new entry, according to their interpretation, broke previously established conventions. And that brings me to my final point on this topic. We can argue all day and night until the heat death of the universe as to who is right or wrong about this subject, but that doesn't matter. I said before that people have different interpretations of the same story, but I think there's a better explanation for why so many fans were dissatisfied with the sequels and why so many others love them and will defend them any way they can. They were made with fundamentally different narrative intent than the first two trilogies and both Clone Wars animated series. They aren't what Lucas intended, and that's not just because they tossed his outline aside before writing them, or because of Rian Johnson's hard left turn in the middle, but because the people in creative control wanted to do different things with the new movies.
Can I just say though, a lot of times I would say to Ryan, you gotta think about the band. And he said, no, you gotta think about the story, and you gotta think about our movie.
I brought up Luke's fall from grace and Rey's rapid rise to power and compared them to Man of Steel to make a point about hardcore fans' expectations for new media. But statistically, casual fans make up the bulk of audiences. Thus, we get two groups that disagree fervently. There's a whole other video I could make about how fan bases can become divided. Not necessarily toxic, because that's a bigger conversation, but divided, which can still lead to toxicity. I'm sure you all know about the extreme amount of online backlash certain people involved with the franchise have gotten. One of the most famous cases being Kelly Marie Tran, who left social media, and given what I said at the beginning of this video about no tolerance for hate, you can probably tell that I don't approve of any of this. If you don't like a movie or you don't agree with someone else's opinion of a movie or any piece of media really, then do so respectfully and just walk away. Don't go out of your way to attack people to try and have your view dominate all others. That can cause real harm over a movie opinion of all things. It's also not the Jedi way, so in this case you're also demonstrating that you didn't learn anything from the story that you claim to love. Okay, with all this context established, where does that leave us? Well, if it was just the movies and subsequent TV shows, I'd have just left a long time ago and not given it much more thought, aside from continuing to watch Visions. If that were the case, I wouldn't even be making this video. But unfortunately, none of this happened in a vacuum. yeah, not all the hate thrown around in the wake of The Last Jedi and Rise of Skywalker was from fans. Back then, I saw a bunch of YouTube channels that I won't name right now that were covering this and arguing against it. So of course, I watched their content. Why? Because they were some of the only people who were actually criticizing the movies and, more importantly, were calling the media out for decrying the fans as sexist. Also racist because of what happened to Kelly Marie Tran. Yes, this wasn't what everyone was saying. There were people criticizing the movie normally, but the backlash to the fan backlash dominated the conversation. But if you actually read the articles, you won't find any direct quotes of the people in question saying the things the titles claim they did. Even if that wasn't the case, claiming that disliking a movie or show that happens to have a woman or minority character automatically makes someone an ist or phobe is a Mott and Bailey argumentation fallacy. A logical falsehood that uses non-controversial claims to defend more radical claims. It's incredibly frustrating when people do this with legitimately important causes like feminism, where disagreeing with them can get you branded as discriminatory. All of this will be important later, though the discourse did lead to me learning about many people I never even thought about before. Let's get to the elephant in the room. Now, I'm fully aware of the fact that I currently am not now, and certainly wasn't then, fully aware of Kathleen Kennedy's actions, statements, and intentions. But one, that isn't relevant to this conversation, since I'm talking about my experience as it happened. And two, everything I'm aware she did say undeniably feels like corporate fluff, the kind of non-controversial statements someone in her position is supposed to make. Now, I am aware that Kathleen Kennedy has been targeted and her statements have been inflated by those channels I mentioned before, but the statements I can attribute to her don't paint the best picture either. For example, there was that time she responded to a question about how difficult it was to make the next movie, Rise of Skywalker at the time, by saying that every movie is difficult to do partially because they have no source material. They don't have comic books, novels, or a bunch of other stuff. Which demonstrates that she kind of forgot about the EU, or how many fans cared about it. Or that time that Marsha Lucas spoke favorably of her, but also said that she doesn't know what she's doing with the franchise. But to sum up my thoughts on Kathleen Kennedy, I think she's seriously out of touch and maybe kind of dumb. Mostly because of how every quote I could find from her seems like manufactured corporate fluff. Like I explained before, I don't have the same conspiracy theory that other people do around her. Obviously, there is no way for me to know for sure what is going on behind the scenes, though the simplest explanation is often the correct one. Kennedy's intentions aren't bad, but the decisions she's made as president of Lucasfilm have been in the name of feminism and diversity. Worthy causes, but I don't agree with what she and those like her have done in pursuit of those goals. And personally, I firmly believe that same goal could have been achieved without any of the drama or baggage. Instead, she has kind of given feminism and diversity a bad name among certain fans. Briefly jumping forward a bit, the discussion sparked by the cancellation of The Acolyte is largely what sparked the desire in me to expedite the creation of this video that's been kicking around in my brain for the past several years. And conveniently, it demonstrates a lot of what I've been saying. Apart from being a project that Kathleen Kennedy was a primary supporter of,
Star Wars is always about rebels versus institutional threat. So if we said it then the Jedi become the antagonists. Not the bad guys, but they become the bad guys to the bad guys. And I gotta say, Kathy really responded to that. I think it's difficult to do a show that is critical in any way of the Jedi. And I think that you saw that with Ryan's film. In that moment, people were very nervous about saying this particular institution may not be the light and, perfect, stunning group of heroes that are totally nobly intentioned. But I think when you think you're going to tell the story about bad guys and the Jedis might be the antagonists to those Jedis, I think that makes people nervous. But it didn't make Kathy nervous.
Editing Mythos here, I realized that I didn't do the best job of specifying what I was trying to say here. Brie Larson's statements and Leslie Headland's creative choices with The Acolyte aren't all that inflammatory. What really caused the firestorm on social media was the specific context combo of creative choices, possibly contradictory to the existing franchise's creative vision, followed by fan backlash, followed by media shaming fans and calling them discriminatory, followed by certain influencers reacting to all of it and blaming the activism, or post the release of The Last Jedi, the middle two steps can be skipped, but aren't always skipped, and the established rage bait influencers just get angry at any mention of diversity for clicks. The point I'm getting at here is that you can't just point fingers and lay the blame entirely on the fans being toxic, or even on the influencers being inflammatory. It's the engagement-driven algorithms that run social media which enable this sort of hate campaign. Her and Leslie Headland's vision do not align with the original vision of Star Wars. Headland wanted to make a series that cast the Jedi in an unfavorable light, having them commit more morally questionable and even tyrannical things, portraying them as significantly more flawed than they were in the prequels and Clone Wars, while also portraying the dark side in a more favorable or at least sympathetic manner. It's an interesting idea that has a lot of potential, and could be explored in Star Wars, but like I said earlier, probably should not have been a part of the main timeline, and would be better suited to a non-canon side story like Visions. Speaking of Visions, actually, Season 2, Episode 2 actually made the Sith perspective sympathetic in a way that would have worked in the main timeline, by making it a story around conquering fear, yet still making it clear that the Sith way is not the right way. Jedi that stay true to the light side are fundamentally selfless. Control and domination is a dark side trait. The Jedi of the prequels fell and drove Anakin to the dark side because they became too detached, not because they got too tyrannical. But returning to the pre-Mandalorian era, the bottom line is, following the release of Rise of Skywalker, mainstream perception of Star Wars as a franchise was not good. The idea getting pushed was that the fans were being entitled, toxic, bigoted, and the franchise as a whole was just kinda dumb. Sort of like right now. But two things helped break the never-ending spiral of heated discussion. The first was John Boyega and Daisy Ridley, Finn and Rey's actors, revealing some things about the production of the trilogy. John Boyega saying he was cast for his race, which confirmed what a lot of critics of the time were saying, that his character should have had more time. Daisy Ridley's statement that Rey's true heritage was decided on late in development, which also confirmed what many critics of the time were saying, that there was no plan for the trilogy, they just winged it and it didn't work. Then The Mandalorian was released, which largely heralded the trends of lots of shows getting made leading to where we are now. But what's important for us today is that discussions of representation and wokeness in the mainstream got heated. Even after the talk around Star Wars died down, the damage was done. Wokeness was a hot topic and the media knew it. This unfortunately led to more fuel on the fire as more franchises were getting dragged into the conversation. The first one that I remember was Disney's other massive money-making franchise, Marvel, specifically Captain Marvel, mostly from the actress when she said this. And this. I actually didn't see the movie when it came out because of the controversy. I saw it recently for this video, and I thought it was okay. Not great, not bad, just okay. There were some things I like about it, and even Brie Larson's performance wasn't too bad, and I do like some of the scenes. If I had watched it during the peak of my MCU fan hype, I probably would have really enjoyed it. Though I admit, it isn't as good as many of the other Marvel movies that were coming out at the time. So in the midst of all the controversy churned up by The Last Jedi, I can understand why it attracted as much attention as it did, and why it basically had a passing of the torch effect from The Last Jedi. Then there's the Arrowverse.
I need you to fix his suit.
The suit is literal perfection.
It will be. When it fits a woman.
Moving on to other things I watched just for this video, Mulan, both the original and the remake. And I had a similar reaction as I did to Captain Marvel, just without the MCU context, and with Mulan 2020 being significantly more meh. Mulan is just powerful right out of the gate, and she has to learn not to suppress who she is, and then she just solos all the most powerful enemies in the movie, kind of like Carol. Looking at franchises that I'm less familiar with, this also happened with Doctor Who with the 13th Doctor, the first female Doctor. I can't name very many episodes of Doctor Who aside from the very few I've seen, but I do know of the Timeless Child, and I know it retconned huge amounts of the lore. I know Doctor Who has retconned its continuity before, but I can't name any of those other episodes, nor what series they were from, nor what happens in them. But I know about the Timeless Child because of how inflamed it made the fanbase, so much that even I, someone who doesn't really care about Doctor Who that much, heard about it. But the best example I can give is Masters of the Universe Revelation. I am not a He-Man fan, but I know way too much about what happens right at the beginning of this show. Again, because the fire spread to my circles. He-Man dies immediately and gets replaced by a female character called Teela, who is not happy about many of the things he did before he died. Every one of those examples came out around the same time as The Last Jedi, or after it. And that's without considering all of those articles I showed before, which inflate statements made by people and then don't provide quotes of them saying the thing. This is really just clickbait, something most of us are familiar with, but none of us are immune. Because of all that and John Boyega's complaints, I've legit wondered how many of these diverse casting choices, or even certain creative choices over the past several years, only happened because studio execs knew it would stir up heated debates online and create a ton of free advertising, as well as convincing a bunch of people to go see the movie or watch the show just to piss off the bigots. I can believe that an individual artist or actor wants to provide representation for genuine reasons. But I am less likely to believe that about an executive. There's no way to know for sure what instances were made for that reason, but it's a phenomenon that has been capitalized on by corporations before. Pamgaea has a video about this exact thing, and it doesn't even talk about narrative-focused media like shows and movies. So with all that being said, why are people fighting for diversity? No, really, this is a serious question. I mean, you think I'd know at this point since I've made a few videos on the topic, but that's because I've been told by other people that it's important. Like, a lot of people. And I've had my own experiences with it that I've spoken on before. But when it comes to actual, observable scientific evidence, I honestly tried. I even whipped out Google Scholar, something I haven't done since college, to try and find some evidence, and after several attempts, I got nothing. So just going off of what other people have said, and my own experience as an ADHD, asexual, non-binary individual, representation is about a few things. The first is acknowledgement. Having a critical part of your identity be ignored and possibly unknown to the people around you and society at large can feel alienating, especially if it's something you don't fully understand. Simply having it acknowledged can feel validating. Which brings me to, second, relatability. Feeling not just acknowledged, but understood. Helping someone connect to a story on a much deeper level, which carries all the usual effects a good story can have on a person. I've seen some naysayers say, why can't you relate to a character that isn't exactly like you? But just going off of my own experience, it's not that we can't relate our personal life to a character that isn't exactly like us, it's more so relating via a particular experience or aspect of your identity. Just looking at my favorite Percy Jackson Universe Top 20 Favorite Characters video that I made a few months ago, I love characters like Alex and Reyna for how I related my gender variance and asexual experiences respectively to them. Neither of them is exactly like me, but I still appreciate that they exist, and I loved the scenes with them, even though neither of them was my favorite character on that list. Like, my favorite fictional character of all time in all media is literally a cis-straight white guy with blonde hair and blue eyes. Aside from the white part, none of those things describe me. Third is education. Many identities are still not known in the mainstream, so sometimes the media can help others understand the group being represented. Which brings me to my final point, desensitization. This is a small point, but I thought it was worth mentioning. Exposure can help people get used to seeing someone different and seemingly alien. In fact, this doesn't just apply to different groups of people, it can be literally anything that the person is afraid of due to a lack of experience. And this is just my view, and if you have your own experiences you'd like to share, please do so in the comments. Especially if you're from an underrepresented group I couldn't cover, like BIPOC people or certain religious groups. Though this begs the question. With all these examples I've just given of diversity being added and it stirs up online hate, which means free advertising, can diversity be added without, that, or harming the narrative or lore of an existing franchise? Why is that even a question? Of course it can, and it's been done many times. Sure, some drama might get stirred up, but it doesn't need to be as bad as it was with Star Wars. Actually, that brings me to my next topic. Examples of representation being done right without needing the attached drama. Starting off, I want to look at women or minority characters leading previously male-led franchises. First, there's Jolene Cujo from JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, Part 6, Stone Ocean. Now, I know that Part 6 has a somewhat controversial reputation in the JoJo fanbase, but 1, it's not because it stars a woman, and 2, it's nowhere near as heated as the discourse we've looked at so far. And 3, there are a lot of fans that defend it and have come forth talking about how much they love it, myself included. From what I can tell, now that anime-only fans have gotten to experience it properly, and manga readers don't have to depend on fan translations, Stone Ocean is somewhat more respected in the JoJo fandom, despite the fact that it starts off with, minor spoiler warning, the previous male lead, the most iconic character in the series, getting completely disabled, and the focus is just put on these 3 girls. Araki just did what he always does, and made the best effort to give them the same treatment as the previous JoJo teams, and it works. Another example, The Legend of Korra. Now, this show is also somewhat controversial within its fanbase, and there are many who don't like it, but like Stone Ocean, it's still respected and enjoyed by the majority of existing hardcore fans. And it added a lot to the world and lore of the franchise, and while not all of it is good, there's enough there that it had a net positive effect on the Avatar franchise as a whole. Oh, and Korra's bisexual, though this was only touched upon. And the fans at large still love her, despite LGBTQ+ rep not being as common in kids' cartoons back in the day. Getting a bit more explicitly gay, let's look at the Percy Jackson universe. Author Rick Riordan has taken a few representational opportunities with his series before, such as the Kane siblings from the Kane Chronicles being multiracial, Magnus questioning his sexuality in the Magnus Chase series, and Apollo being very openly bisexual in Trials of Apollo. But for this section, I wanted to focus more on The Son of the Star, a book he co-wrote with openly queer author Mark Oshiro for that added bit of authenticity. I've already talked about this book before on my channel, so I'll be brief here. It takes the gay Nico D'Angelo and his bisexual boyfriend Will Solis and dives deep into their psyches, including their queer struggles, and we watch them come out the other side as stronger people. It's a great story, and I highly recommend it and the entire Riordanverse to anyone willing to give it a read. Stepping outside of examples explicitly about passing the torch in big franchises, there are tons of others I could give, but I don't have the time right now. So we've established that this did not need to happen, but the fact of the matter is that it did happen, so where does this leave us? Well, the controversy kept going for a while because people kept putting fuel on the fire, and it's continued to this very day. Part of the problem is how polarized these conversations got. Because of the algorithms running our daily lives, giving us more of what we agree with, anger spreads rapidly and polarization is inevitable. And that has consequences. Remember those YouTube channels I brought up before who criticized The Last Jedi and called out the media for shaming fans? Whom I did not name explicitly, but you all probably know about them already. The Critical Drinker, Nerdrotic, Geeks and Gamers, Heels v Babyface, Shadiversity, etc. Yeah, I used to watch a few of their videos unironically because they were angry for the same reason I was. Getting labeled man-babies for disliking a film. But eventually they moved on from Star Wars and other things like it, and started ranting about the mere mention of diversity in basically any new piece of media. And they grew and grew over the years to the point where many of them have hundreds of thousands or even millions of subscribers. That's how you get Starfield Pronouns Guy going viral. Which begs the question, what the fuck did I just watch happen? Well, just looking at what we know, it looks like the controversy happened due to incompetence and mishandling a popular franchise, and the media chose to capitalize on that. Possibly executives did too. Then a bunch of YouTubers jumped on it, causing them to grow dramatically to the point where they are basically a media empire that runs on never-ending rage at the latest thing. And we've gone from fandom misunderstandings to literally millions of people who've been told that diversity equals bad. And the woke mob are taking over your favorite franchises, and it's gotten bad enough that the people who work on these franchises are starting to notice and acknowledge the backlash even more. But that's not all that happened. You see, this guy, he's Tim Pool, and he runs a podcast. And he also had Nerdrotic from the group I mentioned before on said podcast. Why is any of that important? Well, Tim Pool was discovered as having been receiving funding from Russia, which isn't too surprising considering he was spouting anti-Ukraine sentiments. So there's clearly some common sentiments between these two. And no, I'm not claiming all of Nerdrotic's group are pro-Russia or anti-Ukraine. I'm just saying they clearly agree on at least a few things. I do not have it in me to cover a topic like this. I do not want real-world geopolitics on my channel. So I'll link videos by Pillar of Garbage and Illegal Eagle that can explain it much better than I can. Ugh, that escalated quickly. But to take things back to Star Wars and other franchises for a moment, we come at long last to the primary reason I made this video. Almost no one on the outside seems to possess any understanding of why things turned out like this. Despite the discourse centering on one of the biggest film franchises in existence, which is probably due to most fans being casual fans, though it's the other major consequence I've seen of polarization. Too many people in real life, even those I know and trust, don't seem to get why fans of certain franchises are upset. And this goes for basically every YouTube channel I've seen that is not always in the Star Wars discussion. They'll say things like media has always been political and give a number of examples as to why, often using the original Star Wars trilogy itself in the process, but none of them seem to grasp why the discourse got to the point that it has. If you're a mega fan of a particular franchise, most people in your real life are probably not, so you probably won't find anyone to talk to about it, or anyone who empathizes with your complaints or is even willing to listen to you. But you're still pissed and you want something to validate your anger, so you turn to social media. And like I said before, anger spreads online, whatever gets the most engagement gets promoted by the algorithm, and thus toxic fans have dominated the critical side of the discourse. So people respond to them and counter their arguments since they were made by bigots. But this ends up eclipsing conversations around the story, and that has prevented criticism of it, even good faith criticism, especially from hardcore fans from even being in the discourse with progressives. Though that may just be my experience. And thus the echo chamber polarization feedback loop continues. Having realized all of this, I wondered how alone I was, because at the time, I was someone who identified as a cishet man for most of their life, and grew up with Star Wars, so I understood why hardcore fans got as angry as they got. But I was also raised to see discrimination as a bad thing, and eventually learned to accept and support the LGBTQ people in my life, long before I realized I was one of them. So I understand the other side, and felt like there was no need for media discussions to go down the road that they did. I get that racism, misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, anti-Semitism, etc. are all massive problems in our society today. But a big reason why things have gotten as bad as they did is because new entries in existing franchises pissed fans off because they were either bad sequels or were just incompetently made. Then the media poured gasoline on the flames, and the algorithms that run internet discourse did what they do best and recommended more content that gets the most engagement. For a while, I thought I was largely on my own in my understanding of this, but in recent memory, I've started seeing more people acknowledge at least some of the issues I've discussed in this video. It's not much, but it feels a lot better knowing I'm not alone in my beliefs and experiences here. And there is one more bit of franchise discourse I'd like to highlight. Let's talk about Rings of Power. When the show was being promoted, we started seeing that there were going to be black elves. And I'm sure I don't need to summarize what happened next at this point. But anyways, sometime later, we got this video from a known Tolkien expert, Timothy Hickson, aka Hello Future Me. It was a massive breakdown of the show analyzing why it doesn't work as a show or as an adaptation of the appendices of Lord of the Rings. Yeah, fun fact, Amazon does not have the rights to the Silmarillion, only appendices referring to it. In any case, the video used to end with a massive look at the anti-woke influencers, or the woke bros as Tim called them, until Tim cut it out because he realized it didn't match what he was trying to say. But before he removed it, a few commenters had some of their own takes on the engagement farm. Marina Angelska says, "I'm just disappointed that one important aspect was not mentioned in the woke bros discussion. It wasn't all lonely young men who watched those videos. I, as a feminist woman, ended up watching them for one simple reason. If you call people racist when they're not, if you call people bigoted when they're not, you just push them to the channels who won't insult them every second and will not make them feel like they're crazy for wanting Tolkien's lore and writings to be respected. As you said, there are ways to introduce diversity in these stories and keep true to what Tolkien wrote. But when anyone mentioned that, they were immediately called a racist and bigot. People don't seem to understand that the quickest way to radicalize is to keep calling someone an ist or phobe when they are not. Yes, as a woman, woke bro videos are sometimes hard to watch, or were. I don't watch any of them anymore. But sometimes you only want to watch a video without being insulted. And unfortunately, at times it can feel like they are the only ones providing that." Tim noticed this and said, "You're totally spot on here, totally worth bringing into the discussion." A space ostrich said, I distinctly remember calling this trend out as a kid in high school. My generation were essentially all feminists by default. It's how we were raised, and if I remember hitting high school, call-out culture had started hitting its stride and people would get called sexist or racist at the drop of the hat, when they weren't. I remember looking around and seeing all the young men that were struggling and being called sexist and privileged whenever they tried to talk about their issues. This was when the term privilege first hit the public vocabulary, so it was used everywhere. And I said at the time, if you keep doing all this, you're going to push all these young men towards the right. When they're faced with two sides, and one side openly mocks them and calls them sexist when they complain about it, while the other side is welcoming, understanding, and calls the first side out, which do you think they are going to go towards? In response, I was called sexist, of course, and people said if being called sexist makes you sexist, you were sexist all along. Needless to say, Kid Me hit the nail on the head. And the manosphere began to emerge a few short years after I predicted it would. I think the older progressives don't quite understand how dominant progressive ideas were in younger generations. When the millennials were growing up, feminism and progressive ideas were the underdog. When I was growing up, they were the default, which means you've got a whole generation of young men being treated like shit by both traditional society and the dominant popular culture of their time. The people who are supposed to be the quote-unquote good guys of society making things better, essentially telling them that they don't matter, and that they're bad people for even having problems in the first place. If you're ever wondering how the alt-right gained popularity, this is why. They were handed power on a silver platter by bigoted faux progressives in the late 2000s and early 2010s. It was so obvious even an ignorant sheltered child like I was at the time could see it coming. There's technically more comments in that thread, but I'm going to end it with Linda McNamara1298, who touches on a lot of points I've already made in this video. Agreed. I also think would need to rewatch some of these woke bro videos to confirm, and I don't really want to, but I think some of their earliest videos on Rings of Power did focus a bit more on actual writing issues in a genuine way, but that is what made their channels took off. They got an audience of a particular demographic who want to see this content be more political, or sexist, racist, homophobic more specifically, and they started pandering to that audience to earn more YouTube dollars. I recall going off these guys when they really started going off a hateful deep end. Yes! Fuck yes! I could not have put it any better myself. I have seen a number of people talking about how the rage bait engagement farm works, but with very few exceptions, I don't really see pro-diversity channels acknowledge the faults of the people who make these unfaithful sequels, or the media who stoked the fire. There's a reason I used the comments from Hello Future Me's video, because that's literally the only place I could find any serious discussions of this topic. And when your feelings are dismissed, you look for validation elsewhere. Thus the feedback loop continues. That's why I made this video. To share my story and to speak to both sides for just a moment. If you're someone who genuinely wants more diversity in the media you love, consider looking for examples of it being done well that also respects the existing franchise. Or creating your own if you have the skills to do so. And if you're someone who cares about these young men and you don't understand why they don't like a new quote-unquote progressive piece of media, even after watching this long, let them dislike it, even if you disagree. As long as their reasoning isn't obviously bigoted. Ultimately, I did all this because I was frustrated, and not with Star Wars itself. When The Force Awakens came out, all I wanted was to enjoy a story like I'm sure most people who watched the movies, and I'd love to just move on with my life at this point, but with how synonymous disliking the sequels, and Rey in particular, and The Acolyte has become with toxic screaming fans and harassing actresses, I was often afraid to express how I really felt, and that was without the self-discovery I was going through with my sexuality and my gender. In a way, I felt torn between staying true to my community and being honest about my views in the sequel trilogy. It's something that's affected videos all the way back to the beginning of my channel. But as you can tell, at this point, I decided to just voice how I really felt. And you can disagree with me, and if you've got a better way to address any of the societal issues I've brought up, or you've got factual evidence that one or more of my points is wrong, please let me hear them. All I want is for people to respect each other's opinions. Now before I end this video, I've got one more point to make. When I see feminists creating media like the sequel trilogy, Captain Marvel, Masters of the Universe Revelation, Mulan 2020, and The Acolyte, I agree with what they're trying to do. but I don't agree with their methods. Something I've seen remarkably few people acknowledge, outside of my trans and NB siblings, is that the patriarchy hurts men too. Manly men stereotypes make it hard for them to express their emotions without being perceived as weak. It's harder for them to approach women socially without being perceived as sexual. As someone designated male at birth, I can attest to those personally. In our society today, girls mature faster and they get better grades. People have fought for women's rights and progress has been made, but it's gotten to the point where women are outperforming men in some key areas. So if you want to combat the patriarchy, you should consider acknowledging men's issues and offering them empathy and help, or even a solution if you can. And perhaps the solution isn't pitting men and women against each other or trying to put one above the other or deflecting criticism of a piece of media by telling men it wasn't made for them, but to let everyone make their own way regardless of stereotypes. Have your inclusive main casts, BIPOC characters, queer characters, strong independent women, but also consider including examples of positive, healthy masculinity. And I want to say here that power level doesn't even need to be a factor. Some of the most beloved characters in fantasy or superhero stories are those with less power, or even those without powers. And being me, I'd be remiss if I didn't take the opportunity to recommend a few stories that exemplify what I'm talking about. I brought up both Avatar cartoons, the Riordanverse, and JoJo's Bizarre Adventure before, but there's also all of this other stuff that I don't have the time to talk about right now. But I'd recommend in a heartbeat to anyone who is interested. And that's without all of the books, manga, and anime that I've either got videos on, or have videos coming down the pipeline covering, which may be out by the time you're watching. Not all of them are perfect, and plenty of them have their flaws or blind spots, but each one has plenty of its own strengths. If you're a young, straight, cisgender, able-bodied white man, or perhaps someone with most of those qualities who's also frustrated by how the culture war has treated you, I thank you for indulging me for this long, and I hope I can offer you something that you will genuinely enjoy, despite how different we may be. But whoever you are, if you've watched this long, I thank you dearly. Thank you so much for just letting me share my side of the story. And no matter where you came from, I hope to see you again next time.